Baby deer begs, humans to save her mom, and what happened next silenced the entire rescue team. The morning air in the Cascade foothills was sharp and clean, carrying the scent of pine resin and damp earth. It was early June, and the forest was alive with the sounds of awakening, birdsong layered over the distant rush of a creek swollen with snowmelt. The sunlight filtered through the canopy in golden shafts, illuminating the dust motes that drifted lazily in the stillness. Sarah Callahan had been driving the old logging road for nearly 20 minutes when she first saw it, a flicker of movement at the edge of the gravel path. She slowed her truck instinctively, her eyes narrowing as she tried to make sense of what she was seeing. Then she saw it clearly, a fawn, no more than a few weeks old, standing in the middle of the road. The little deer was trembling, her spindly legs barely able to hold her upright. Her coat was still dappled with the white spots of infancy, and her large, dark eyes were wide with something that looked unmistakably like panic. Sarah pulled the truck to a stop and cut the engine, her heart already beginning to race. She had worked with the North Cascade Wildlife Rescue for nearly a decade, and she knew the rules. Never approach a fawn alone in the wild. The mother was usually nearby, and human interference could do more harm than good. But this fawn wasn't running. She wasn't hiding. She was standing there, staring directly at Sarah's truck, and then, impossibly, she took a step forward. Sarah opened the door slowly, her boots crunching softly on the gravel. "Hey there, little one," she murmured, her voice low and soothing. "Where's your mama?" The fawn didn't bolt. Instead, she took another step closer and then another. Her ears swiveled forward, and she let out a soft, high-pitched bleat, a sound so plaintive and desperate that it sent a chill down Sarah's spine. The fawn bleated again, louder this time, and then turned her head sharply to the left, toward the dense undergrowth that bordered the road. Sarah's pulse quickened. Something was wrong, very wrong. She reached into the truck and grabbed her radio, keying the mic. "Dispatch, this is Sarah. I'm about 3 miles up Old Timber Road. I've got a fawn here acting unusual. She's not running, and she's trying to get my attention. I think there might be an injured adult nearby, requesting backup." The radio crackled. "Copy that, Sarah. We'll send a team. ETA 15 minutes. 15 minutes felt like an eternity. Sarah crouched down, keeping her distance from the fawn but watching her closely. The little deer was pacing now, moving back and forth between Sarah and the edge of the forest, bleating continuously. Her distress was palpable, and Sarah felt a tightness in her chest. She had seen animals in distress before, countless times, but there was something different about this, something almost intentional. "Okay, sweetheart," Sarah said softly, standing up. "Show me." The fawn's ears pricked up at the sound of her voice. She turned immediately and trotted toward the tree line, pausing every few steps to look back over her shoulder, as if to make sure Sarah was following. Sarah's breath caught. She had heard stories, anecdotes from other rescuers, old-timers who swore that animals could communicate, could ask for help in ways that defied explanation. She had always been skeptical, but now, watching this tiny creature lead her into the forest with such clear purpose, she wasn't so sure. If you're enjoying this story, please subscribe and stay with us. The undergrowth was thick, a tangle of ferns and blackberry bushes that scratched at Sarah's jeans as she pushed through. The fawn moved with surprising agility, her small body slipping easily through gaps that Sarah had to force her way past. The bleating continued, a rhythmic, urgent sound that echoed through the trees. And then Sarah heard something else, a low, guttural sound that made her stop in her tracks. It was a groan, deep and pained, and it was coming from just ahead. She pushed through a final curtain of branches and stumbled into a small clearing. What she saw made her stomach drop. A doe lay on her side in the center of the clearing, her body twisted at an unnatural angle. Her breathing was shallow and labored, each exhale accompanied by a soft wheeze. One of her hind legs was caught in a rusted steel trap, the kind that had been illegal in the state for over a decade, but still turned up in the backcountry from time to time. The trap's jaws had clamped down just above her hock, and the surrounding fur was matted with blood. The doe's eyes were half-closed, glazed with pain and exhaustion. The fawn ran to her mother immediately, nuzzling her neck and bleating softly. The doe didn't respond. She didn't even lift her head. Sarah's hands were shaking as she pulled out her radio again. "Dispatch, I need that team here now. I've got an adult doe caught in a leg trap. She's in bad shape. I'm going to need a vet, bolt cutters, and a transport crate. This is urgent." "Copy. Team is en route. Hang tight, Sarah." Sarah knelt down a few feet away from the doe, her mind racing. The trap was old and heavily rusted, but it was still doing its job. The doe had clearly been struggling for hours, maybe longer. The ground around her was torn up, the earth scraped raw by her desperate attempts to free herself. Sarah could see the exhaustion in every line of her body, the way her ribs heaved with each breath. The fawn stood beside her mother, her small body pressed against the doe's neck. She looked up at Sarah, and for a moment their eyes met. There was no fear in the fawn's gaze, only a raw, desperate plea. "I know," Sarah whispered, her voice breaking. "I know, baby. We're going to help her. I promise." The minutes stretched out like hours. Sarah stayed close, murmuring soft reassurances to both the doe and her fawn, though she wasn't sure if either of them could hear her. The forest around them was silent now, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Finally, she heard the sound of engines in the distance, trucks grinding their way up the old logging road. Relief flooded through her, but it was tempered by a gnawing fear. She had seen injuries like this before. She knew how quickly infection could set in, how much damage a trap could do to bone and tissue. The doe was still alive, but that didn't mean she would stay that way. The rescue team arrived in a flurry of motion, 3 trucks, 6 people, all of them moving with practiced efficiency. Sarah stood up and waved them over, pointing toward the clearing. "She's in here, leg trap. She's been here a while." The team moved quickly, spreading out around the doe. Dr. Marcus Chen, the team's lead veterinarian, knelt beside the injured animal, his face grave as he examined the wound. He didn't say anything, but Sarah could read the concern in his eyes. "We need to get this trap off her now," Marcus said quietly. "Sarah, keep the fawn back. I don't want her getting hurt." Sarah nodded and gently scooped up the fawn, who struggled briefly before going still in her arms. The little deer's heart was racing, a frantic drumbeat against Sarah's chest. 2 of the team members moved in with bolt cutters, working carefully to pry open the trap's jaws. The doe groaned again, a sound so full of pain that it made Sarah's eyes sting. The fawn bleated in response, a high, keening cry that cut through the clearing like a knife, and then, finally, the trap sprang open. The doe's leg fell free, and Marcus immediately moved in, his hands gentle but firm as he assessed the damage. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. Marcus looked up at Sarah, and she saw something in his expression that made her blood run cold. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity. Marcus's hands moved carefully over the doe's injured leg, his fingers probing gently through the matted fur and dried blood. The rest of the team stood in a loose circle around them, their faces tight with concern. Sarah held the fawn close, feeling the rapid flutter of the little creature's heartbeat against her chest. "Talk to me, Marcus," Sarah said quietly, though part of her didn't want to hear the answer. Marcus sat back on his heels, wiping his hands on a cloth. His expression was carefully neutral, the face he wore when he was trying to hide bad news. The legs badly damaged. The trap crushed the bone just above the joint. There's significant tissue damage, and I'm seeing signs of infection already. She's been here at least 12 hours, maybe longer. "Can you save the leg?" one of the other team members asked. Marcus hesitated. "I don't know yet. We need to get her back to the clinic, get her stabilized, run x-rays. But I'll be honest, this is severe. Even if we can save the leg, she might never walk properly again. And for a wild deer..." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. Sarah felt the fawn shift in her arms, and she looked down to see those large, dark eyes staring up at her. The little deer had gone quiet now, but there was something in her gaze that made Sarah's throat tighten. It was trust, pure, absolute trust. "We're taking her in," Sarah said firmly. "We don't make that call out here. We get her to the clinic, we do everything we can, and then we decide." Marcus nodded slowly. "Agreed. Let's move." The team worked with practiced efficiency, sliding a canvas stretcher beneath the doe's body and lifting her carefully. She was too weak to struggle, her head lolling to one side as they carried her toward the trucks. Sarah followed with the fawn still in her arms, the little deer's eyes never leaving her mother. They loaded the doe into the back of the largest truck, which had been converted into a mobile treatment unit. Marcus climbed in beside her, already preparing an IV line. Sarah tried to set the fawn down, but the moment her hooves touched the ground, she bolted toward the truck, bleating frantically. "Sarah, we can't take the fawn," one of the team members said gently. "You know the protocol. If the mother doesn't make it, this fawn won't survive on her own anyway," Sarah interrupted, her voice sharper than she intended. "She's too young. She's still nursing. And look at her. She's not going to leave her mother's side. We separate them now, and we're just adding more trauma." Marcus looked up from the IV line. "Bring her. We'll figure it out." Sarah climbed into the truck with the fawn, settling onto a bench along the side wall. The little deer immediately pressed herself against Sarah's legs, her body trembling. The doe lay on the stretcher in the center of the space, her breathing shallow but steady. Marcus had already started fluids, and he was now cleaning the wound on her leg with careful, methodical movements. The truck lurched into motion, and the forest began to slide past the windows. Sarah found herself stroking the fawn's head absently, her fingers running over the soft, velvet-like fur. She had been with the rescue team for 10 years, and in that time she had seen hundreds of animals: bears, cougars, eagles, wolves. She had pulled creatures from traps, from car accidents, from starvation and disease. She had saved many. She had lost many more, but she had never seen anything quite like this. "Marcus," she said quietly, "have you ever seen a fawn behave like that? The way she came to me, the way she led me to her mother?" Marcus didn't look up from his work, but she saw the corner of his mouth twitch. "I've been doing this for 15 years, Sarah. I've seen a lot of things that don't fit neatly into textbooks. Animals are smarter than we give them credit for, more aware. They understand cause and effect. They recognize patterns. This little one saw humans before, probably saw us from a distance, maybe near the road. She made a connection. Humans mean help. That's a pretty sophisticated connection for a 3-week-old fawn. Desperation makes us all smarter," Marcus said softly. "Animals, humans, doesn't matter. When someone you love is dying, you'll try anything." Sarah looked down at the fawn, who had finally stopped trembling. The little deer's eyes were half closed now, exhaustion finally catching up with her. But even in her drowsiness, she kept one ear turned toward her mother, monitoring every sound. The drive back to the North Cascade Wildlife Rescue Facility took 40 minutes, though it felt much longer. The clinic was located on the outskirts of a small town called Ridgemont, nestled in a valley between 2 mountain ranges. It was a modest operation, a main building that housed the surgical suite and recovery rooms, a series of outdoor enclosures for larger animals, and a small office where Sarah and the other coordinators managed the endless paperwork that came with running a non-profit. They pulled up to the main building just as the sun was reaching its zenith, flooding the valley with bright, unforgiving light. The team moved quickly, unloading the doe and wheeling her into the surgical suite. Sarah followed with the fawn, who had woken up the moment the truck stopped and was now bleating again, her distress palpable. "Sarah, take her to the nursery," Marcus called over his shoulder as he disappeared through the surgical doors. "Get her fed, get her calm. I'll update you as soon as I know more." The nursery was a small room at the back of the building, lined with crates and warming lamps. It smelled of hay and milk formula, a scent that Sarah had come to associate with both hope and heartbreak. She set the fawn down gently in one of the larger crates, but the little deer immediately tried to climb back out, her hooves scrabbling against the metal bars. "Hey, hey, it's okay," Sarah murmured, kneeling down beside the crate. "Your mama's getting help, the best help. But you need to eat, sweetheart. You need to stay strong for her." She mixed a bottle of fawn formula, warming it under the tap until it was body temperature. The fawn refused it at first, turning her head away and bleating mournfully. But Sarah was patient. She had done this dozens of times before. She held the bottle steady, letting a few drops fall onto the fawn's lips. The little deer's tongue flicked out instinctively, tasting the milk. After a moment, she latched onto the nipple and began to drink. Sarah sat back on her heels, watching the fawn nurse. The tension in the little body began to ease, the frantic energy giving way to something calmer. But even as she drank, the fawn's eyes kept darting toward the door, as if she could see through the walls to where her mother lay on the operating table. "She's going to fight," Sarah whispered. "Your mama's a fighter. I can tell." The hours that followed were some of the longest of Sarah's life. She stayed in the nursery with the fawn, who dozed fitfully between bouts of anxious pacing. Sarah tried to distract herself with paperwork, with phone calls, with anything that would keep her mind occupied. But her thoughts kept drifting back to the surgical suite, to Marcus and his team working to save a life that hung by the thinnest of threads. It was nearly evening when Marcus finally emerged. His scrubs were stained with blood, and there were dark circles under his eyes. Sarah stood up immediately, her heart in her throat. "She's alive," Marcus said, and Sarah felt her knees go weak with relief. "But it was close. The infection was worse than I thought. I had to debride a significant amount of tissue, and the bone fracture is complex. I've stabilized her for now, but the next 48 hours are critical." "The leg?" Sarah asked. Marcus's expression darkened. "I managed to save it. For now. But Sarah, you need to understand, even if she survives, even if the infection doesn't come back, the damage is severe. She's going to have limited mobility. In the wild, that's a death sentence." Sarah felt something cold settle in her chest. "So, what are you saying?" "I'm saying we need to prepare for the possibility that she can't be released. And if she can't be released—" He trailed off, but the implication was clear. Sarah looked down at the fawn, who had woken up and was staring at them both with those impossibly large eyes. "Can I see her? The mother?" Marcus nodded. "She's in recovery, still sedated but stable. Come on." They walked down the hallway together, their footsteps echoing in the quiet building. The recovery room was dimly lit, the air heavy with the smell of antiseptic and anesthesia. The doe lay on a padded table, her injured leg wrapped in layers of white bandages. An IV line ran from her foreleg, and a monitor beeped softly in the corner, tracking her vital signs. Sarah approached slowly, her hand reaching out to touch the doe's neck. The fur was soft and warm beneath her fingers. "You did good, Mama," she whispered. "You held on. Now you just need to keep holding on." Behind her, Marcus cleared his throat. "Sarah, there's something else you should know. When I was cleaning the wound, I found something embedded in the tissue. Fragments of rust and something else. I sent a sample to the lab, but I'm pretty sure it's going to come back as poison." Sarah's head snapped up. "Poison?" "Someone set that trap deliberately," Marcus said, his voice hard. "And they laced it. Whoever did this wasn't trying to catch an animal. They were trying to kill one." The words hung in the air like smoke, acrid and suffocating. Sarah stared at Marcus, her mind struggling to process what he had just said. "Poison," she repeated slowly. "You're telling me someone deliberately poisoned that trap?" Marcus nodded, his jaw tight. "I won't know for certain until the lab results come back, but I've seen this before. There are people out here, poachers mostly, sometimes just people who hate wildlife, who set traps and coat them with toxins. It's barbaric, but it's effective. The animal gets caught, the poison enters the bloodstream through the wound, and even if they manage to escape the trap, they die within hours." Sarah felt a wave of nausea roll through her. She looked back at the doe, at the steady rise and fall of her chest, at the bandages wrapped around her shattered leg. But she's still alive. Barely. And only because we got to her when we did. Another few hours. Marcus shook his head. The poison was already in her system. I had to flush it out, give her chelating agents, antibiotics, anti-inflammatories. She's on a cocktail of medications right now that would knock out a horse. Literally. Sarah's hands clenched into fists at her sides. In her 10 years with the rescue, she had seen the worst of what humans could do to animals. She had pulled bullets from bears, fishing line from eagles' throats, plastic bags from the stomachs of deer. But this felt different. This felt personal. Someone had set that trap knowing exactly what it would do, knowing the suffering it would cause. "We need to report this," she said, her voice hard. "We need to get Fish and Wildlife out there, find out who's responsible." "Already done," Marcus said. "I called it in while you were with the fawn. They're sending an investigator tomorrow morning. But Sarah," he paused, choosing his words carefully, "you know how these things go. Unless they catch someone in the act, unless there's clear evidence pointing to a specific person, the chances of finding who did this are slim." Sarah knew he was right, but that didn't make it any easier to accept. She turned back to the doe, her hand resting gently on the animal's shoulder. "She fought so hard," she whispered. "She held on for her baby, and some bastard out there doesn't even care." They stood in silence for a moment, the only sound the soft beeping of the heart monitor. Then Marcus cleared his throat. "There's something else. Something I noticed when I was examining her." Sarah looked up. "What?" "She's older than I initially thought. Based on her teeth and overall condition, I'd say she's at least 8, maybe 9 years old. That's elderly for a wild deer. And she's had multiple fawns. I can tell from the scarring on her udder. This little one we have in the nursery. She's probably not her first, maybe not even her 5th. Sarah felt something shift in her chest. "So she's a survivor. More than that. She's a matriarch. In deer populations, the older does are the ones who teach the younger generation where to find food, how to avoid predators, which paths are safe. They're the memory of the herd. Losing her doesn't just mean losing one animal. It means losing years of accumulated knowledge, of survival instincts that get passed down." Sarah looked at the doe with new eyes, seeing not just an injured animal, but a repository of wisdom, a living link in a chain that stretched back generations. "Then we can't let her die," she said quietly. "We can't." Marcus's expression softened. "I'm going to do everything I can, Sarah. You know that. But you also know that sometimes everything we can do isn't enough." Sarah left the recovery room and returned to the nursery, where the fawn was awake and pacing again. The moment Sarah entered, the little deer rushed to the edge of the crate, her hooves clattering against the metal. She bleated once, a questioning sound, and Sarah felt her heart break a little. "She's alive, baby," Sarah said softly, opening the crate and lifting the fawn out. "Your mama's alive. She's sleeping right now, but she's alive." The fawn nuzzled against Sarah's neck, and Sarah held her close, feeling the warmth of the small body against her chest. She had tried, over the years, to maintain professional distance. It was one of the first things they taught you in wildlife rescue. Don't get attached. These aren't pets. They're wild animals, and your job is to heal them and release them, not to love them. But sometimes distance was impossible. She carried the fawn down the hallway, moving quietly so as not to disturb the other animals in recovery. When she reached the door to the room where the doe lay, she hesitated. Marcus had said the mother was still sedated, still unconscious. But Sarah had seen enough animals reunited with their young to know that sometimes awareness went deeper than consciousness. She pushed the door open and stepped inside. The doe hadn't moved, her body still and peaceful on the padded table. Sarah approached slowly, the fawn trembling in her arms, and then, when they were close enough, she lowered the fawn down beside her mother. The effect was immediate. The fawn's entire body relaxed, her trembling stopping as if someone had flipped a switch. She pressed herself against her mother's side, her small head resting on the doe's shoulder, and then she made a sound, not a bleat, but something softer, something that sounded almost like a sigh of relief. Sarah stood back, watching them. The monitor continued its steady beeping, the IV dripped its slow rhythm, and in the dim light of the recovery room, mother and child lay together, two lives bound by something stronger than pain or fear. Sarah pulled out her phone and took a photo. She wasn't sure why, maybe for the records, maybe just to have proof that this moment had existed. Then she settled into a chair in the corner of the room, pulling a blanket around her shoulders. She knew she should go home, should get some sleep, but she couldn't bring herself to leave. The night stretched on, quiet and heavy. Sarah dozed fitfully, waking every time the monitor's rhythm changed, every time the doe shifted or the fawn made a sound. Around 3 a.m, she woke to find Marcus standing in the doorway, a cup of coffee in each hand. "Thought you might need this," he said, handing her one of the cups. Sarah took it gratefully, wrapping her hands around the warm ceramic. "How's she doing?" "Vitals are stable. Better than I expected, honestly. She's a fighter." Marcus pulled up another chair and sat down beside her. "You should go home, Sarah. Get some real sleep." "I will. Soon." She took a sip of the coffee, feeling the caffeine begin to work its way through her system. "Marcus, what are her chances?" "Really?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment. "If we're just talking about survival, maybe 60-40. The infection is the biggest risk right now. If we can keep that under control for the next 48 hours, her odds go up significantly. But if we're talking about her being able to return to the wild..." He shook his head. "That's a different question. Because of the leg. Because of the leg, because of her age, because of the trauma. Even if the leg heals, she's going to have a permanent limp. She won't be able to run at full speed, won't be able to escape predators. And with winter coming in a few months..." He didn't finish the sentence. Sarah looked at the fawn, still curled against her mother's side. "And what about her? If the mother doesn't make it, or if she can't be released? The fawn's young enough that we could potentially hand-raise her and release her in the spring. But it's not ideal. Hand-raised deer sometimes have trouble integrating with wild populations. They don't learn the social cues, the survival behaviors. They're more vulnerable. So we're looking at two animals who might not be able to survive in the wild." "Possibly." Marcus set his coffee cup down and leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "Sarah, I know what you're thinking, but we can't keep them. We don't have the facilities for long-term care of deer, and even if we did, the permits alone would take months. Our job is to rehabilitate and release. That's it." "I know," Sarah said quietly. But even as she said it, she knew that this situation was different. This wasn't just about following protocol. This was about two lives that had already beaten impossible odds, about a bond between mother and child that had literally led them to salvation. As if sensing her thoughts, the doe stirred. It was subtle, just a slight movement of her head, a soft exhalation. But then her eyes opened dark and glassy with sedation, but unmistakably aware. She looked around the room slowly, her gaze unfocused, until it landed on the fawn beside her, and then something remarkable happened. The doe's head lifted, just an inch or two off the table. It was clearly an effort. Sarah could see the strain in her neck, the trembling in her muscles, but she pushed through it, lowering her muzzle to her fawn and breathing in deeply, scenting her baby. The fawn responded immediately, nuzzling against her mother's face and making soft, contented sounds. Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes. Beside her, Marcus had gone very still. "I've never..." Marcus started, then stopped. "She shouldn't be conscious yet. The sedation I gave her should have kept her under for at least another 2 hours. But the doe was conscious. More than that, she was present. Her eyes, though still clouded with drugs and pain, were focused on her fawn with an intensity that transcended her physical state. She nuzzled her baby once more, then seemed to look directly at Sarah. It was impossible to say what passed between them in that moment. Sarah didn't believe in telepathy, didn't believe in mystical connections between species, but she felt something, a recognition, an understanding, a silent communication that needed no words. "Thank you. Please, save her." The doe's head lowered back to the table, her eyes closing again. The effort had exhausted her. But the fawn remained pressed against her side, and the monitor continued its steady beeping. And Sarah knew with absolute certainty that she would do whatever it took to keep this family together. Marcus stood up slowly, his coffee forgotten. "I need to check her vitals," he said, his voice rough. He moved to the doe's side, his hands gentle as he examined her. After a moment, he looked back at Sarah. Her heart rate spiked when she woke up, but it's settling now. She's okay." Sarah nodded, not trusting herself to speak. "I'm going to increase her pain medication," Marcus continued. "And I want to run another blood panel in a few hours, check the infection markers. But Sarah—" He paused, meeting her eyes. "I think she's going to make it. I don't know how, but I think she's going to make it." The dawn came slowly to the valley, painting the sky in shades of rose and amber. Sarah had finally dozed off in the chair sometime around 4 in the morning, her head tilted at an awkward angle against the wall. She woke to the sound of voices in the hallway and the smell of fresh coffee drifting through the building. She sat up, her neck protesting the movement, and immediately looked toward the table where the doe lay. The fawn was still curled against her mother's side, both of them sleeping peacefully. The monitor showed steady vitals, and the doe's breathing seemed deeper, more regular than it had been during the night. Marcus appeared in the doorway looking surprisingly alert for someone who had been up most of the night. "Morning," he said quietly. "How are our patients?" "Stable, I think," Sarah said, standing and stretching. Every muscle in her body ached. She woke up again around 5, just for a minute, checked on the fawn, then went back under. Marcus moved to the doe's side, checking the IV line and examining the bandages on her leg. "The swelling's gone down," he said, a note of cautious optimism in his voice. "That's a good sign. I'm going to run that blood panel now, see where we are with the infection." He drew blood quickly and efficiently, the doe barely stirring. Then he looked at Sarah. "Why don't you go home? Get a shower, get some real sleep. I'll call you if anything changes." Sarah wanted to argue, but she knew he was right. She was exhausted, and she wouldn't be any good to anyone if she collapsed. "Okay," she said reluctantly, "but you call me the second." "The second anything happens," Marcus finished. "I know. Go." Sarah drove home through the early morning light, the roads nearly empty. She lived in a small cabin about 15 minutes from the rescue center, a place she had bought 5 years ago with money inherited from her grandmother. It was modest but comfortable, surrounded by pine trees and overlooking a small creek. It was the kind of place where she could decompress after difficult days, where the sounds of the forest could wash away the weight of loss and failure. But today, as she pulled into her driveway, she felt no sense of peace. Her mind was still back at the clinic, still with the doe and her fawn, still turning over the implications of what Marcus had told her about the poisoned trap. She showered quickly, the hot water helping to ease some of the tension in her muscles. Then she made herself eat something, toast and eggs that she barely tasted, and tried to sleep. But sleep wouldn't come. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the doe's eyes looking at her, felt the weight of that silent plea. After an hour of tossing and turning, she gave up. She grabbed her laptop and settled at her kitchen table, opening her email. There were the usual messages, donation requests, volunteer schedules, updates from other rescue organizations, but there was also a new message from Marcus, sent just 20 minutes ago. Blood work came back. Infection markers are down significantly. She's responding to the antibiotics. I think we're past the worst of it. Also, Fish and Wildlife Investigator is here. Wants to talk to you when you get a chance." Sarah felt a surge of relief at the first part of the message, followed immediately by a tightening in her chest at the second. She closed her laptop and headed back to her truck. The fish and wildlife investigator was a woman named Janet Reeves, tall and weathered with sharp eyes that missed nothing. She was standing in the clinic's small office when Sarah arrived, examining a map of the area spread out on the desk. "Miss Callahan," Janet said, extending a hand. "Thanks for coming in. I know you've had a long night." "It's fine," Sarah said, shaking her hand. "Have you been out to the site?" "Just got back. I found the trap, or what's left of it. Your team cut it open pretty thoroughly." Janet pulled out a tablet and swiped through several photos. "But I found something else. 3 more traps, all within a half-mile radius of where you found the doe. All of them the same type, all of them set illegally." Sarah felt her stomach drop. 3 more? 3 that I found. There could be others." Janet's expression was grim. "This isn't some random poacher, Miss Callahan. This is systematic. Someone is deliberately targeting the deer population in that area." "But why?" Sarah asked. "Deer aren't worth anything. The meat's not valuable enough to justify this kind of effort, and it's not hunting season. That's what I'm trying to figure out." Janet set the tablet down and leaned against the desk. "I pulled property records for the area. Most of it's national forest, but there are a few private parcels. One of them belongs to a man named Dale Hutchins. You know him?" Sarah shook her head. "Should I? Maybe. He's had run-ins with fish and wildlife before. Nothing major. Mostly disputes about property boundaries and hunting regulations. But about 6 months ago, he filed a complaint claiming that deer were destroying his property, eating his garden, damaging his trees, that sort of thing." "That's not exactly unusual," Sarah said. "Deer do that. It's what they do." "Right, but Hutchins was insistent. He wanted the state to come in and cull the population. When we told him that wasn't going to happen, he got angry. Made some threats about taking care of it himself." Janet paused. "At the time, we didn't think much of it. People say things when they're frustrated. But now you think he's the one setting the traps. I think it's worth looking into. I'm going to pay him a visit this afternoon, see what he has to say." Janet straightened up, tucking the tablet under her arm. "In the meantime, I've got a crew going through that section of forest, pulling up any traps they find. We'll keep searching until we're confident the area's clear." Sarah nodded, but her mind was already racing ahead. "Janet, if Hutchins is responsible for this, what happens to him? Depends on what we can prove. Setting illegal traps is a misdemeanor, usually results in a fine. But if we can prove he used poison, that's a felony. He could be looking at jail time, significant fines, loss of hunting privileges." Janet's expression hardened. "I'm going to do everything I can to make sure he faces consequences. What he did to that doe, it's not just illegal, it's cruel." After Janet left, Sarah found Marcus in the recovery room. He was changing the doe's bandages, his movements careful and precise. The fawn was awake, standing on wobbly legs beside the table and watching her mother intently. "How's she doing?" Sarah asked. "Better," Marcus said, and there was genuine relief in his voice. "The wound is starting to granulate, which means it's healing. The infection is under control. She's not out of the woods yet, but—" He trailed off, then smiled slightly. "I think she's going to make it, Sarah. I really do." Sarah felt something loosen in her chest, a tension she hadn't even realized she'd been carrying. "And the leg? Will she be able to walk on it?" Marcus's smile faded. "That's the question, isn't it? The bone is healing, but there's significant soft tissue damage. Tendons, ligaments, they don't heal the same way bone does. Even with physical therapy, even with the best-case scenario, she's going to have limited mobility." He looked at Sarah, his expression serious. "We need to start thinking about what comes next." "What do you mean?" "I mean, we need to have a plan. If she can't be released, we need to find her a placement. There are sanctuaries that take in deer, places where she could live out her life safely. But those spots are limited, and the application process can take months. Sarah looked at the doe, at the fawn pressed against her side. What if we kept her here, just temporarily, while we figure things out? Marcus shook his head. Sarah, you know we can't. We're a rescue and rehabilitation facility, not a sanctuary. We don't have the permits, the funding, or the space for long-term care. And even if we did, keeping a wild animal in captivity when there are other options, he sighed. It's not what we do. But what about her? Sarah gestured to the fawn. If we send the mother to a sanctuary, what happens to her baby? We hand-raise her and release her in the spring, like I said. It's not ideal, but it's the best option we have. So we separate them. Sarah's voice was flat. After everything they've been through, after that fawn literally saved her mother's life, we just separate them. Sarah, no, Marcus. I'm sorry, but no. That fawn led me to her mother. She begged for help. She understood that humans could save her, and she trusted us to do it. And now we're going to repay that trust by tearing them apart. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was gentle. I understand what you're feeling. I do, but we have to think about what's best for both of them in the long term. And sometimes, what's best isn't what we want it to be. Sarah knew he was right. She knew that emotion couldn't override practicality, that good intentions didn't change the reality of their situation. But knowing something intellectually and accepting it emotionally were two very different things. Let me make some calls, she said finally. Let me see what options are out there. Maybe there's a sanctuary that can take both of them. Maybe there's a solution we haven't thought of yet. Marcus nodded. Okay. But Sarah, don't get your hopes up. These situations, they rarely have happy endings. Sarah spent the rest of the day on the phone. She called every sanctuary she knew, every wildlife facility within a 5-state radius. She explained the situation over and over. The doe, the fawn, the poisoned trap, the bond between them. Most of the responses were sympathetic but ultimately unhelpful. Sanctuaries were full, or they didn't take deer, or they didn't have the resources for an animal with special medical needs. By late afternoon she was exhausted and discouraged. She had one more number to try, a place called Haven Ridge Wildlife Sanctuary, located about 3 hours north in the mountains. She had heard of them but had never worked with them directly. They had a reputation for taking difficult cases, for going above and beyond when other facilities couldn't or wouldn't help. The phone rang 4 times before someone picked up. Haven Ridge, this is Tom. Sarah launched into her explanation, trying to keep her voice steady and professional despite the fatigue and frustration. She described the doe's injuries, the fawn's behavior, the poisoned trap. She talked about the bond between mother and child, about the impossibility of separating them. When she finished, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. That's quite a story, Tom said finally. His voice was deep and thoughtful, with a slight accent she couldn't quite place. And you're sure about the fawn's behavior? She really led you to her mother? I'm sure, Sarah said. I've been doing this for 10 years and I've never seen anything like it. Another pause. Then, can you send me photos, medical records, x-rays, anything you have? Of course. But Tom, I need to know, do you have space? Can you take them? Let me look at the records first, Tom said. But I'll tell you this much. If what you're describing is accurate, if that bond is as strong as you say it is, then separating them would be cruel. And we don't do cruel here at Haven Ridge. Give me until tomorrow morning. I'll call you back. The line went dead, and Sarah sat back in her chair, feeling the first flicker of hope she'd had all day. Sarah spent that evening at the clinic, unable to stay away. She sat in the recovery room with the doe and her fawn, watching as the mother grew stronger hour by hour. The doe was awake more often now, her eyes clearer, more alert. She would lift her head to nuzzle her fawn, to scent the air, to take in her surroundings with what seemed like cautious curiosity. The fawn, for her part, had become noticeably more relaxed. She still stayed close to her mother, but the frantic energy that had defined her in those first hours had given way to something calmer. She would nurse, then doze, then wake to groom her mother's face with her small pink tongue. It was a scene of such tender intimacy that Sarah found herself holding her breath, afraid to disturb it. Marcus came in around 8 o'clock, carrying a tray with fresh bandages and medication. "You're still here," he said, though there was no surprise in his voice. "Couldn't stay away," Sarah admitted. "How's she looking?" Marcus set the tray down and moved to examine the doe. She watched him with wary eyes but didn't struggle as he checked her vitals and carefully unwrapped the bandages on her leg. "Remarkable," he said after a moment. "The swelling is almost completely gone, and the wound is healing cleanly. No signs of infection, no necrosis. If I didn't know better, I'd say this injury was a week old, not 2 days. Is that normal?" "No, it's extraordinary." Marcus rewrapped the leg with fresh bandages, his movements gentle and practiced. "I've seen animals heal quickly before, but this, I think she's healing faster because of her." He nodded toward the fawn. "Having her baby close, knowing she's safe, it's reducing her stress, which means her body can focus on healing instead of just surviving." Sarah felt a lump form in her throat. "So keeping them together is helping." "Undeniably." Marcus finished with the bandages and stepped back. "Which is why I hope your sanctuary contact comes through, because you're right, Sarah. Separating them now would be cruel." They stood in silence for a moment, watching mother and child. Then Marcus's phone buzzed. He pulled it out, glanced at the screen, and his expression darkened. "It's Janet, the investigator. She wants us to call her." Sarah's stomach tightened. "Now! Now!" They went to the office, and Marcus put the phone on speaker. Janet answered on the first ring. "Marcus, Sarah, thanks for calling back. I wanted to update you on the Hutchins situation." "What happened?" Sarah asked. "I went to his property this afternoon. He wasn't there, but his wife was. She was cooperative. Scared, actually. She said Dale's been obsessed with the deer for months. Claimed they were ruining his livelihood, destroying everything he'd worked for. She said he'd been setting traps, that he'd been going out at night to check them." Did she know about the poison?" Marcus asked. "She says no, but I'm not sure I believe her. Either way, she told me where he keeps his trapping equipment, a shed behind the house. I got a warrant, went in with a team. We found everything. Traps, poison, even a journal where he'd been documenting his kills." Janet's voice was tight with anger. 17 deer, Sarah. Over the past 4 months, he's killed 17 deer." Sarah felt the room spin. 17! "Most of them does. A few bucks. He was targeting the breeding population, trying to wipe them out. And the poison he was using, it's a compound that's been banned for decades. Highly toxic, incredibly painful. Those animals didn't die quickly." Marcus's jaw was clenched so tight, Sarah could see the muscles jumping. "Where is he now?" "That's the problem. He ran. His wife said he left this morning, right after I showed up asking questions. We've got an APB out, but he's got a head start. Could be anywhere by now." Sarah's hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against the desk, trying to steady herself. "What happens when you find him?" "He's looking at multiple felony charges, animal cruelty, illegal trapping, use of banned substances, possibly even environmental terrorism, depending on how the prosecutor wants to play it. He's going away for a long time." Janet paused. "I'm sorry it took us this long to catch him. If we'd acted sooner, maybe that doe wouldn't have—" "You couldn't have known," Sarah interrupted. "None of us could have." "Maybe, but it doesn't make it any easier," Janet sighed. "I'll keep you updated. And Sarah, that doe and her fawn, they're lucky you found them. Most animals caught in Hutchins's traps didn't get a second chance." After they hung up, Sarah and Marcus sat in silence. The weight of what they'd learned pressed down on them like a physical thing. 17 deer. 17 lives ended in pain and terror, all because one man had decided that his convenience mattered more than their existence. "I need some air," Sarah said finally, standing up. She walked outside into the cool night. The stars were out, scattered across the sky like diamonds on black velvet. She stood there, breathing deeply, trying to process everything. Her phone rang. She pulled it out, expecting it to be Janet with more updates. But the caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize. She answered cautiously. "Hello? Sarah Callahan. This is Tom, from Haven Ridge." Sarah's heart leapt. "Tom? Hi. I wasn't expecting to hear from you until tomorrow." "I know, but I looked at the records you sent, and I couldn't wait." There was something in his voice, excitement maybe, or wonder. "Sarah, what you've documented here is extraordinary. The fawn's behavior, the bond between them, the doe's rate of healing, this is the kind of case that reminds people why wildlife conservation matters. So, does that mean you can take them?" "It means more than that. I want to build a program around them." Tom's words came faster now, animated. "We've been looking for a way to educate the public about deer behavior, about the intelligence and emotional capacity of these animals. Your doe and her fawn, they could be ambassadors. We could create an enclosure where they could live together, where people could observe them, learn from them. We could use their story to raise awareness about illegal trapping, about the importance of protecting wildlife." Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes. "You want to keep them together?" "Not just keep them together. I want to celebrate their bond. I want to show the world what you saw in that forest. That animals love, that they communicate, that they're capable of extraordinary things when we give them the chance." Tom paused. "But I need to be honest with you. This isn't a release. They would be living in captivity for the rest of their lives. It would be a good life, a large, natural enclosure, the best veterinary care, no predators, no threats. But it wouldn't be wild. You need to be okay with that." Sarah thought about the doe's injured leg, about the limp she would carry for the rest of her life. She thought about the fawn, so young and vulnerable, who had already learned that humans could be both the source of terrible cruelty and profound kindness. She thought about Dale Hutchins and his 17 victims, about all the deer who hadn't been lucky enough to have a baby brave enough to ask for help. "When can you take them?" she asked. "I can be there in 3 days. I need to finish preparing the enclosure, get the permits in order. But Sarah, I promise you, I will take care of them. They'll have everything they need." "Thank you," Sarah whispered. "Thank you so much." The next 3 days passed in a blur of activity. Marcus worked with the doe, helping her stand, encouraging her to put weight on her injured leg. It was slow, painful work. The doe would tremble, her leg buckling beneath her, and she would have to lie back down. But each time she would try again, and each time the fawn would stand beside her, as if offering silent encouragement. By the 3rd day, the doe could stand for several minutes at a time. She couldn't walk yet, not really, but she could shift her weight, could take a single halting step before needing to rest. Marcus was cautiously optimistic. "She's never going to run," he told Sarah. "But she might be able to walk well enough to move around an enclosure, to live something close to a normal life. It's more than I thought possible 3 days ago." Sarah spent hours with them, sitting quietly in the recovery room, watching the bond between mother and child deepen. The fawn had grown bolder, more playful. She would prance around the room, then return to her mother's side to nurse or to simply stand close. And the doe would watch her with eyes that seemed to hold both love and relief. On the morning of the 3rd day, Tom arrived. He was a tall man in his 50s, with silver hair and kind eyes that crinkled at the corners when he smiled. He spent an hour examining the doe, talking to Marcus about her medical needs, discussing the long-term care plan. Then he turned to Sarah. "Are you ready?" he asked gently. Sarah nodded, not trusting herself to speak. They had prepared a specialized transport crate, large enough for both the doe and her fawn, padded and secure. Marcus had sedated the doe lightly, just enough to keep her calm during the journey. The fawn, sensing something was happening, stayed pressed against her mother's side. The team worked together to move the doe into the crate, supporting her weight carefully. The fawn followed without hesitation, settling beside her mother as if she'd done it 100 times before. Tom secured the crate, then looked at Sarah. "Do you want to ride with us?" he asked. "It's a 3-hour drive, but you're welcome to come see where they'll be living." Sarah glanced at Marcus, who nodded. "Go," he said. "You've earned this." The drive north took them through winding mountain roads, past forests thick with pine and aspen. Tom talked as he drove, describing Haven Ridge, the other animals they cared for, the educational programs they ran. But Sarah was only half listening. Her attention was on the crate in the back of the truck, on the soft sounds of the fawn moving around, on the steady breathing of the doe. They arrived at Haven Ridge just after noon. The sanctuary was beautiful, acres of natural habitat, carefully maintained enclosures that blended seamlessly with the surrounding forest. Tom led them to a large enclosure near the center of the property, surrounded by tall pines and overlooking a small pond. "This is theirs," Tom said, gesturing to the space. 2 acres, natural vegetation, a shelter for bad weather, fresh water, and look, he pointed to a viewing platform on one side of the enclosure. "We built that so people can observe them without disturbing them. They'll be able to live their lives naturally, but they'll also be teaching people, showing them what deer are really like." They opened the crate carefully, giving the doe and her fawn time to adjust. The doe stood slowly, her injured leg trembling but holding her weight. She took a step, then another, her nose twitching as she scented the air. The fawn stayed close, her eyes wide, as she took in the new surroundings. And then something remarkable happened. The doe took another step, and another, moving with more confidence than Sarah had seen since the rescue. She walked to the edge of the pond, lowered her head, and drank. The fawn joined her, and they stood there together, side by side, the afternoon sun filtering through the trees and painting them in gold. Sarah felt tears streaming down her face. Tom put a hand on her shoulder. "You did this," he said quietly. "You saved them, both of them." Sarah shook her head. "No, she saved them." She nodded toward the fawn. "She's the hero of this story." They stood there for a long time, watching mother and child explore their new home. The doe moved slowly but steadily, her limp visible but not debilitating. The fawn bounded ahead, then circled back, always checking to make sure her mother was following. It was a dance they would perform for years to come, a dance of love, of survival, of a bond that had proven stronger than pain, stronger than fear, stronger than death itself. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Sarah finally turned to leave, but before she did, she looked back one more time. The doe was lying down in a patch of soft grass, and the fawn was curled against her side, both of them peaceful and safe. And in that moment, Sarah understood something she had always known intellectually, but had never truly felt: that every life mattered. That every act of kindness, no matter how small, rippled outward in ways we could never fully comprehend. That in saving these 2 lives, they had done something that transcended rescue or rehabilitation. They had borne witness to love. The weeks that followed were a period of adjustment and quiet transformation. Sarah returned to her regular duties at the North Cascade Wildlife Rescue, but she found herself thinking about the doe and her fawn constantly. Tom sent updates every few days, photos, videos, detailed reports on their progress. Each message brought a smile to Sarah's face and a warmth to her chest that she hadn't felt in years. The doe, whom Tom had named Grace, was adapting remarkably well to her new home. Her leg continued to heal, and while the limp would never fully disappear, she had learned to compensate for it. She could walk the length of the enclosure without stopping, could navigate the gentle slopes and uneven terrain with increasing confidence. She had even been seen running, not at full speed, but a gentle, loping gait that spoke of joy rather than fear. The fawn, whom Tom had named Hope, was thriving. She had grown noticeably in just a few weeks, her legs longer and stronger, her coat deepening from the pale brown of infancy to the rich russet of a young deer. She was curious and bold, investigating every corner of the enclosure, tasting every plant, testing every boundary. But she always returned to her mother's side, always checked to make sure Grace was nearby. Tom had begun the educational programs he'd mentioned, and the response had been overwhelming. Families came from all over the region to visit Haven Ridge, to stand on the viewing platform and watch Grace and Hope move through their enclosure. Tom would tell their story, the poisoned trap, the fawn's desperate plea for help, the rescue that had saved them both. And people would listen, their faces reflecting wonder and compassion and sometimes anger at what had been done to these innocent creatures. The story had spread beyond the sanctuary. A local news station had picked it up, running a segment that went viral online. Suddenly, Grace and Hope were famous. Their story was being shared across social media, discussed in classrooms, referenced in articles about wildlife conservation and animal intelligence. Donations poured into Haven Ridge, enough to expand their facilities and take in more animals who needed long-term care. But for Sarah, the most meaningful update came 6 weeks after she had left Grace and Hope at the sanctuary. Tom called her on a Tuesday evening, his voice bright with excitement. "Sarah, you need to come see this. Can you make it up here this weekend?" "What's going on?" Sarah asked, already mentally rearranging her schedule. "I don't want to spoil it. Just trust me. You need to see this in person." Sarah arrived at Haven Ridge on Saturday morning, the autumn air crisp and cool. The trees were beginning to turn, splashes of gold and crimson against the evergreen backdrop. Tom met her at the entrance, practically bouncing with excitement. "Come on," he said, leading her toward Grace and Hope's enclosure. "But we need to be quiet." They approached the viewing platform carefully, Tom gesturing for Sarah to stay low. When they reached the railing, Sarah looked down into the enclosure and felt her breath catch. Grace was standing near the pond, grazing peacefully. But she wasn't alone. Beside her, nursing contentedly, was Hope. And on Hope's other side, watching the fawn with curious eyes, was another young deer, a buck probably around Hope's age, with small nubs where his antlers would eventually grow. "Who?" Sarah started. "His name is Chance," Tom said quietly. "We took him in 3 weeks ago. He was orphaned when his mother was hit by a car. He was traumatized, wouldn't eat, wouldn't interact with any of the other animals. We were worried we were going to lose him." "What happened?" Tom smiled. "Hope happened. We put him in the enclosure next to theirs, thinking maybe seeing other deer would help. And Hope, she went right up to the fence, started making these soft sounds like she was calling to him. And he responded. Within a day they were standing on opposite sides of the fence, just being near each other. So we made the decision to introduce them properly." Sarah watched as Hope finished nursing and turned to the young buck. She approached him slowly, touching her nose to his, and then, in a gesture that made Sarah's eyes sting with tears, she led him over to Grace. The doe looked up from her grazing, regarded the young buck for a long moment, and then lowered her head and nuzzled him gently. "Grace accepted him," Tom said softly. "She's been treating him like one of her own, grooming him, watching over him, teaching him, and Chance, he's eating again, playing. He's going to be okay." Sarah couldn't speak. She watched the 3 deer move together through the enclosure, a makeshift family bound not by blood but by something deeper, by compassion, by the recognition of shared pain, by the simple act of showing up for one another when it mattered most. "There's more," Tom said. "We've had 3 other sanctuaries reach out, asking about our integration methods. They want to replicate what we've done here, creating family groups for orphaned and injured animals, using the bonds between them to aid in healing and rehabilitation. Grace and Hope aren't just ambassadors anymore, Sarah. They're pioneers. They're changing how we think about wildlife care." Back at the North Cascade Wildlife Rescue, Sarah found herself approaching her work with renewed purpose. She had always cared deeply about the animals she helped, But now she understood something fundamental, that healing wasn't just about treating physical injuries. It was about recognizing the emotional and social needs of the creatures in their care, about understanding that animals, like humans, needed connection, needed family, needed love. She began implementing changes at the rescue center. When they took in orphaned animals, she made sure they were housed near others of their species, when possible. She encouraged longer observation periods, looking for signs of bonding and attachment. She worked with Marcus to develop protocols that prioritized keeping family groups together whenever feasible. Marcus, who had initially been skeptical, became one of the program's strongest advocates after seeing the results. Animals healed faster when they weren't isolated. They ate better, showed less stress, adapted more quickly to rehabilitation protocols. The data was undeniable. 3 months after Grace and Hope had gone to Haven Ridge, Sarah received a call from Janet Reeves, the fish and wildlife investigator. "Thought you'd want to know," Janet said. "We found Hutchins. He was hiding out in Idaho, living in a cabin under a false name. He's been extradited back here, and the trial starts next month." "What's he being charged with?" Sarah asked. 17 counts of animal cruelty, illegal trapping, use of banned substances, and, this is the big one, environmental terrorism. The prosecutor is arguing that his actions were designed to cause widespread harm to the ecosystem, not just to individual animals. If convicted on all counts, he's looking at 15 to 20 years. Sarah felt a grim satisfaction. "Good. There's something else," Janet continued. "The prosecutor wants you to testify. They want you to tell Grace and Hope's story, to show the jury what Hutchins's actions actually did. Would you be willing?" Sarah didn't hesitate. "Absolutely." The trial took place in late November in a courthouse in the small town of Ridgemont. The room was packed: journalists, wildlife advocates, local residents who had been following the story. Dale Hutchins sat at the defense table, a thin man with hard eyes and a permanent scowl. He didn't look at Sarah when she took the stand. The prosecutor, a sharp woman named Linda Chen, led Sarah through her testimony. Sarah described finding the fawn on the road, the way the little deer had begged for help, the desperate journey through the forest to where Grace lay trapped and dying. She described the poison trap, the hours of surgery, the touch-and-go battle against infection. "And what happened after the doe recovered?" Linda asked. "She and her fawn were placed at Haven Ridge Wildlife Sanctuary," Sarah said. "They're still there. They're thriving. Can you describe their relationship?" Sarah thought about the videos Tom had sent her just last week. Grace and Hope and Chance moving through the enclosure together, a family forged in the crucible of suffering and survival. "They're inseparable," she said. "The fawn saved her mother's life, and now the mother is teaching her fawn and another orphaned deer how to live, how to trust, how to heal." Linda pulled up a photo on the courtroom's display screen. It showed Grace and Hope standing together by the pond, the afternoon sun painting them in gold. There was an audible reaction from the gallery, soft gasps, murmurs of emotion. "This is what Mr. Hutchins almost destroyed," Linda said quietly. "This bond, this love, this life." She turned to face the jury. "When we talk about animal cruelty, we often focus on the physical harm. But what Mr. Hutchins did went beyond that. He tried to erase something beautiful from the world. He tried to silence a voice that was crying out for help, and if it weren't for Ms. Callahan and her team, he would have succeeded." The defense attorney tried to argue that Hutchins had been protecting his property, that he had a right to control the wildlife on his land. But the evidence was overwhelming. The journal documenting his kills, the banned poison, the systematic nature of his trapping. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning a verdict: guilty on all counts. When the judge handed down the sentence, 18 years in prison with no possibility of parole for at least 12, Sarah felt something release in her chest. It wasn't joy, exactly. Justice didn't erase what had been done, didn't bring back the 17 deer who had died in agony, But it was something. It was accountability. It was the world saying clearly and unequivocally that these lives mattered. Sarah visited Haven Ridge one more time before winter set in. The enclosure had been expanded, and there were now 5 deer living there: Grace, Hope, Chance, and 2 others who had been rescued from various situations. They moved together as a herd, a family of survivors. Tom walked with Sarah along the perimeter of the enclosure, both of them bundled against the cold. "We're getting requests from all over the country," he said. "Other sanctuaries, rescue organizations, even some zoos. Everyone wants to know how we did this, how we created this kind of environment. Grace and Hope have become a model for a whole new approach to wildlife care." "They deserve it," Sarah said. "They've been through so much." They stopped at the viewing platform, watching as the herd grazed peacefully. Hope had grown significantly, her coat thick and healthy, her movements confident and graceful. She was playing with Chance, the 2 of them chasing each other in wide circles while Grace watched from nearby, her expression, if a deer could be said to have expressions, one of contentment. "Do you ever regret it?" Tom asked suddenly. "Not releasing them, keeping them in captivity?" Sarah thought about the question for a long moment. "No," she said finally, "because this isn't just captivity. This is a second chance. Grace would never have survived in the wild with that leg. Hope would have been orphaned, vulnerable. Here they have safety. They have each other. They have a purpose, teaching people that animals are more than just resources or obstacles. They're individuals. They're families. They matter." Tom nodded. "I think so too. And I think they're happy as they can be, given everything they've been through." As if to prove his point, Hope suddenly broke away from her game with Chance and trotted over to where Grace stood. She nuzzled her mother's neck, and Grace lowered her head to groom her daughter's face. It was a moment of such pure, uncomplicated love that Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes for what must have been the 100th time since this whole journey began. "Thank you," Sarah said to Tom, "for giving them this, for seeing what I saw, that they deserved more than just survival. They deserved a life. Thank you for trusting me with them," Tom replied, "and for reminding all of us why we do this work in the first place." Winter came to the mountains with a quiet ferocity, blanketing the valleys in snow and turning the forests into a landscape of white and shadow. At Haven Ridge, the deer moved through their enclosure like ghosts, their breath forming clouds in the cold air. Grace's limp was more pronounced in the cold weather, but she moved with determination, leading her small herd to the shelter when the wind picked up, showing them where the best grazing could be found beneath the snow. Sarah had returned to her routine at the North Cascade Wildlife Rescue, but the experience with Grace and Hope had fundamentally changed her. She found herself looking at every animal that came through their doors with new eyes, asking not just, "How do we heal this creature?" but, "What does this creature need to truly thrive?" It was a cold January morning when Marcus found her in the office, staring at her computer screen with an expression he couldn't quite read. "What's wrong?" he asked. Sarah turned the laptop toward him. On the screen was an email from Tom, and attached to it was a video file. "Watch this," she said quietly. Marcus clicked play. The video showed Grace and Hope's enclosure, filmed from the viewing platform in the early morning light. The snow was pristine, unmarked except for the delicate tracks of the deer. And there, in the center of the frame, was Grace. She was running, not the careful, compensating gait they had seen before, but a real run, powerful, fluid, joyful. Her injured leg still showed a slight hitch, but it didn't slow her down. She ran the length of the enclosure, Hope racing beside her, both of them kicking up sprays of snow. Behind them, Chance and the other young deer followed, the whole herd moving together in a display of pure, unbridled life. Marcus sat back, his eyes wide. That's not possible. The damage to her leg." "I know," Sarah said, "but look at her, Marcus. She's running." They watched the video 3 more times, neither of them speaking. Finally, Marcus shook his head in wonder. I've been doing this for 15 years and I still don't understand it. The body's capacity for healing, the will to survive, it defies everything we think we know. It's not just the body, Sarah said softly. It's the heart. She had a reason to heal. She had hope. As winter gave way to spring, the story of Grace and hope continued to spread. A documentary filmmaker reached out to Tom, asking permission to create a feature-length film about their journey. A children's book author wanted to write their story for young readers. Universities were studying the case, using it to explore questions about animal cognition, emotional bonds, and the ethics of wildlife rehabilitation. But for Sarah, the most meaningful development came in early March, when she received a call from a woman named Rebecca Torres. "Ms. Callahan, my name is Rebecca Torres. I'm a wildlife biologist with the National Park Service. I've been following the Grace and Hope story, and I wanted to talk to you about something." "Of course," Sarah said. "What can I do for you?" "We're developing new protocols for wildlife management in national parks, specifically around human-wildlife conflict. Your case, the way you prioritize the bond between the doe and her fawn, the way you advocated for keeping them together, it's exactly the kind of approach we want to incorporate into our guidelines. Would you be willing to consult with us, help us develop training materials for park rangers and wildlife officers?" Sarah felt a surge of emotion. "You want to use Grace and Hope's story to change policy?" "More than that. We want to use their story to change how we think about wildlife, not as populations or statistics, but as individuals with relationships, with emotional lives that matter. Your work has shown that this approach doesn't just benefit the animals, it leads to better outcomes across the board." Sarah agreed immediately. Over the following months, she worked with Rebecca and her team, helping to develop training programs that emphasized empathy, observation, and respect for the social structures of animal families. The protocols were adopted first by the National Park Service, then by state wildlife agencies, then by rescue organizations across the country. Grace and Hope had become more than just two deer who had survived against impossible odds. They had become a catalyst for change, a living reminder that compassion and science were not opposing forces but complementary ones. It was a warm day in late May when Sarah made her final visit to Haven Ridge. She had been invited to speak at the sanctuary's annual fundraising gala, an event that had grown significantly since Grace and Hope's arrival. Donors and supporters from across the region would be there, along with journalists, wildlife advocates, and families who had been touched by the story. Sarah arrived early, wanting time alone with Grace and Hope before the crowds descended. Tom met her at the gate, his face creased with a smile that had become familiar over the past year. "They're waiting for you," he said. They walked together to the enclosure. The spring had transformed it into a paradise of green grass and wildflowers, the pond reflecting the blue sky like a mirror. The herd had grown to 7 now. Grace and Hope, Chance and 4 others, all of them rescued from situations that would have been fatal without intervention. But it was Grace and Hope that Sarah's eyes sought out. They were standing together near the far edge of the enclosure. Grace's head lowered as she grazed. Hope standing guard beside her. At a year old, Hope was nearly as large as her mother now, her coat sleek and healthy, her movements confident and sure. Sarah approached the fence slowly, and Hope's head came up immediately. For a moment, the young deer simply stared at her. Then, impossibly, Hope began to walk toward the fence. Grace lifted her head, watching, and then she, too, began to move, her limp barely noticeable now after months of healing and strengthening. They came to the fence together, mother and daughter, and stood there looking at Sarah. Hope made a soft sound, not quite a bleat, but something gentler, more complex. And Grace lowered her head and exhaled softly, her dark eyes meeting Sarah's, with an expression that seemed to hold recognition, gratitude, and something that looked remarkably like peace. Sarah reached out slowly, her hand hovering near the fence. She didn't touch them. That boundary was important, a reminder that they were still wild creatures despite their captivity. But the gesture was enough. Hope took a step closer, and Grace remained at her side. And for a long moment, the three of them simply existed together in that space, connected by a thread of shared history and mutual understanding. "I think they remember you," Tom said quietly from behind her. "I think they do," Sarah whispered. That evening, Sarah stood on a small stage in Haven Ridge's event hall, looking out at a sea of faces. She had never been comfortable with public speaking, but tonight felt different. Tonight, she wasn't speaking for herself. She was speaking for Grace and Hope, for all the animals who had suffered at human hands, and for all those who had been saved by human compassion. "A year ago," she began, her voice steady, "I was driving down an old logging road when I saw a fawn standing in the middle of the path. She was trembling, terrified, but she didn't run. Instead, she came toward me, and in that moment, she did something extraordinary. She asked for help." Sarah told the story then, all of it. The desperate journey through the forest, the poisoned trap, the hours of surgery, the decision to keep mother and child together despite the protocols that said otherwise. She talked about Dale Hutchins and his 17 victims, about the trial and the justice that had finally been served. She talked about the changes that had rippled outward from one small act of compassion, the new protocols, the expanded facilities, the shift in how wildlife professionals approached their work. But most importantly, Sarah said, her voice growing softer, "I want to talk about what Grace and Hope have taught us. They've taught us that animals love, that they grieve, that they communicate in ways we're only beginning to understand. They've taught us that the bonds between parent and child, between family members, are not uniquely human, they're universal. They transcend species, transcend language, transcend everything we thought we knew about the natural world." She paused, looking out at the audience. Many of them had tears in their eyes. Grace and Hope survived because a baby deer was brave enough to ask for help, and because a team of people was willing to listen. But they're thriving because we made a choice to see them not as cases or statistics, but as individuals with lives that mattered, with relationships that deserved to be honored and protected. Sarah gestured toward the windows, beyond which the enclosure lay in darkness. They're out there right now, living their lives. Grace is teaching Hope and the others how to be deer, how to find food, how to recognize danger, how to exist in a world that can be both beautiful and cruel. And Hope is teaching us something just as important, that courage comes in all sizes, that love transcends species, and that sometimes the smallest voice can change everything. The applause that followed was thunderous, but Sarah barely heard it. Her mind was already back in that forest, back in that moment when a tiny fawn had looked at her with desperate eyes and had somehow communicated a plea that transcended words. "Please, save her, save us." And they had. Against all odds, against protocol and probability and the weight of 17 other deaths, they had saved them both. Later that night, after the gala had ended and the guests had departed, Sarah stood alone at the viewing platform. The moon was full, casting silver light across the enclosure. She could see the herd bedded down together in a loose circle, their bodies dark shapes against the pale grass. Grace and Hope were in the center, Hope's head resting on her mother's flank, both of them peaceful and safe. Tom came to stand beside her, 2 cups of coffee in his hands. He offered her one, and they stood in comfortable silence, watching the deer sleep. "Do you think they're happy?" Sarah asked finally. "Really happy?" Tom considered the question. "I think happiness is complicated, for animals and humans alike. They've lost their freedom. They'll never know what it's like to roam wild, to choose their own path. But they have safety. They have each other. They have a purpose. And they have something that most wild deer never get: time. Time to grow old. to watch their family grow, to simply exist without the constant threat of predation or starvation or human cruelty. He took a sip of his coffee. Is that happiness? I don't know, but I think it's close. Sarah nodded slowly. I think you're right. And I think they've given us something too. They've reminded us why we do this work, why we fight for every life, even when it seems hopeless. Because every life contains the possibility of something extraordinary, like a fawn who could ask for help. Like a fawn who could ask for help, Sarah agreed. They stood there until the coffee grew cold, watching the herd sleep beneath the moon, and in that moment, Sarah felt a profound sense of completion, of a circle closing. The journey that had begun with a desperate plea on a lonely forest road had led here, to this sanctuary, to this family, to this quiet moment of peace. Grace and hope had survived. More than that, they had taught the world something essential about compassion, about connection, about the invisible threads that bind all living things together. Their story would continue to ripple outward, touching lives and changing minds, long after Sarah was gone. But for now, in this moment, it was enough to simply stand here and bear witness, to honor the courage of a baby deer who had refused to give up, to celebrate the love of a mother who had fought to stay alive for her child, to acknowledge the power of humans to be both the source of terrible cruelty and profound kindness. The night was quiet, the stars bright overhead, and in the enclosure below, Grace and Hope slept on, safe and together, their story written not in words, but in the simple fact of their continued existence, a testament to the enduring power of love, the resilience of life, and the extraordinary things that can happen when we choose to listen to the voices that cry out for help. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from and if you've ever witnessed or lived something like this.